She walks along the river in the last light of the day. The water is wide here, wider than she has ever seen it anywhere else, though she has walked its banks since childhood. It moves slowly, brown and heavy with silt, curving south through flat country that seems to go on without limit. On both sides, the forest stands tall and close, the canopy unbroken, the air beneath it thick with the smell of resin and wet earth, and the slow decay of leaves that have been falling in this place for longer than any person could imagine. The trees are immense, straight-trunked, branchless for 30 or 40 meters, their crowns lost in a green ceiling that filters the evening light into something gold and underwater. Somewhere above, a hornbill calls a low, rhythmic croaking that carries across the canopy. Beneath it, the constant hum of insects, layered and dense, a sound so continuous it becomes a kind of silence. She is carrying fish. 3 of them, wrapped in leaves, still cool from the water. The camp is close. She can smell the smoke and faintly through the forest air. The mud between her toes is warm. The river, when she steps into the shallows to cross a sandbar, is warmer still. It has always been warm. The rains are late this year, but they will come. They always come. The land stretches in every direction, flat and green, uninterrupted. If she were to walk east, she would walk for weeks through forest and grassland before reaching mountains that rise sharp and volcanic from the plain. If she walked north, the forest would thin eventually into drier country, the rivers would narrow, the soil would change. South, the land continues a vast coastal plain, the river widening into a delta so broad that where it finally meets the sea, you cannot see across it. West, more rivers, more forest, more of the same world. She has always known green and warm and alive and old beyond reckoning. She does not know that this land has a name, that people will give it 20,000 years from now. She does not know that the river she walks beside this enormous, slow-moving body of water that drains a region larger than any single modern nation in Southeast Asia will be called the Molengraaf, named for a Dutch geologist who will never see it flow. She does not know that the flat ground beneath her feet is a continental shelf, a shallow platform of ancient rock that sits barely above sea level, and that the sea is patient, and the ice that holds the oceans in check is already beginning to fail. She knows the river. She knows the forest. She knows the smoke of her camp, and the sound of her children's voices through the trees. That is enough. It has always been enough. But the world she is walking through, this immense and unbroken, river-laced expanse of tropical lowland connecting everything she can see to everything she cannot, is not permanent. It is borrowed land, borrowed from the ocean during a cold age, a time when glaciers locked so much water into ice that the seas dropped 120 meters and the floors of shallow oceans became dry ground, became forest, became home. The ice is melting, not today, not in her lifetime or her children's lifetimes or their children's. But the process has begun in places she will never see, in the mountains of Scandinavia, in the valleys of North America, in the vast white plains above Siberia. Meltwater is trickling into rivers, rivers into seas, seas rising by fractions of a millimeter each year. It is nothing. It is imperceptible. It is the beginning of the end of everything she knows. The continent she is standing on, a landmass nearly 2 million square kilometers in extent, larger than the Indian subcontinent, connecting the Malay Peninsula to Borneo, Borneo to Java, Java to Sumatra. All of it one unbroken piece of earth will disappear beneath the ocean over the next 13,000 years. The river she walks beside will drown. The forest will drown. The camps, the paths between them, the places where her grandmother was born and her grandmother's grandmother, before her, all of it, under salt water, under silt, under the weight of an ocean that does not remember what it covered. The South China Sea will fill. The Java Sea will fill. The Strait of Malacca, which today separates Malaysia from Sumatra, will cut open like a wound. The mountain peaks will become islands. The islands will become the scattered archipelago that we call Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, names given to fragments of something that was once whole. And the people, they will scatter. They will take to boats, some of them, and become the greatest seafarers the ancient world will ever know. They will carry genes and languages and stories of a great flood, stories of a homeland swallowed by the sea, stories told on islands across half the Pacific that echo and faintly the memory of what was lost. But that is later. That is the story we have come to tell. For now, she walks. The river is warm. The fish are fresh. The smoke of the camp drifts through the trees. And the land goes on and on and on in every direction, solid and green and old beyond measure, as though it will never end. It will. Tonight, we follow the drowning of a continent. We trace the rivers that are now mapped beneath the sea. We listen for the people who lived on land that no longer exists. And we ask what it means, not in myth, not in metaphor, but in the actual and geological, measurable truth, to lose a homeland to the ocean, one generation at a time. This is the story of Sundaland. The sonar pings once every 2 seconds. In the control room of a research vessel anchored over the South China Sea, a marine geologist watches the screen as the signal returns. Green lines resolve against black, tracing contours in the seafloor 40 meters below the hull. What she is looking at should not be there, not in the middle of an ocean. A river channel, clearly defined, deeply incised, meandering across the shelf floor like a scar. It branches, it curves, it follows the same lazy, silt-heavy logic of every major tropical river on Earth, bending south toward a delta that no longer exists, draining a continent that no longer exists, carrying water from mountains to a coastline that was swallowed by the very sea this ship is floating on. She traces the channel with her finger on the glass. Upstream, it splits into tributaries that once gathered water from the highlands of Borneo, from the lowlands of Sumatra, from rivers that now flow into the sea in opposite directions, oblivious to the fact that they were once the same system. This is the Molengraaf River, named for GAF. Molengraaf, the Dutch geologist who first hypothesized its existence in 1921, decades before sonar could prove him right. At its peak, during the last glacial maximum, it was one of the largest river systems on Earth. Larger than the Danube, larger than the Mekong, draining a catchment area that stretched from the mountains of central Borneo to the coast of Vietnam, across a landmass so vast and so flat that the gradient from coast to shelf break averaged just 0.03 of a degree. And it was not alone. 4 great river systems once carved their way across the Sunda Shelf. The Molengraaf flowed north into the South China Sea. The Siam River drained the Gulf of Thailand, extending the Chao Phraya southward through what is now open water. The Malacca Strait River ran between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, a channel of fresh water where today the busiest shipping lane in Asia separates 2 nations. And the East Sunda system gathered the runoff from Java's northern coast, flowing east through land that is now the Java Sea. Together, they drained a continent. That word continent is not metaphor. At the last glacial maximum, roughly 22,000 years ago, when ice sheets locked enough water into glaciers to drop sea levels 120 meters, the Sunda Shelf was fully exposed. The Java Sea was dry. The South China Sea was smaller by half. The Gulf of Thailand was a freshwater lake, fed by rivers that no longer reach it, surrounded by forests that no longer stand. The total landmass added to Southeast Asia was approximately 1.85 million square kilometers. That is larger than the Indian subcontinent, larger than Alaska, the islands of Borneo and Java and Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula were not islands at all. They were the highlands of a single, unbroken piece of earth mountains rising from a vast tropical lowland, connected by plains, laced by rivers, covered in forest. In the centre of the shelf, where the Gulf of Thailand now sits, a freshwater lake formed in a topographic depression, a body of water fed by rivers from every direction, its shores fringed by forest, its sediments accumulating layer by layer in a record that would survive the drowning and eventually be pulled up in core samples by researchers who would read the layers like a diary. Fresh water at the bottom, brackish in the middle, marine at the top. The autobiography of a lake that became a sea. And the forest was extraordinary. Step into it 22,000 years ago, somewhere in the interior of the shelf, the land that is now the floor of the Karamata Strait between Borneo and Sumatra. The air is thick, not with fog, but with moisture and resin and the deep, fungal sweetness of a forest that has been decomposing and regenerating in place for millions of years. The canopy is 60 meters above you in places dipterocarp trees, the dominant family of Southeast Asian rainforest, their trunks rising straight and branchless for 40 meters before exploding into crowns that interlock so tightly the sky is just a rumour of light. The understory is layered ferns and palms and rattans, orchids clinging to bark, strangler figs slowly swallowing their hosts. The smell is camphor and damp earth and oleoresin. The dipterocarps produce aromatic resins that seep from their bark, a scent so specific to these forests that you would know where you were with your eyes closed. The sound is layered to cicadas in sheets. Bird calls cutting through at specific frequencies, the occasional crash of a branch falling from the canopy, the rustle of something large moving through the undergrowth, something large. Because this forest was not empty. Tigers ranged across all of Sundaland from the Malay Peninsula to Java, a continuous population unbroken by ocean. Sumatran rhinoceroses browsed in the shade of the dipterocarps. Asian elephants moved along the river corridors, following the same paths their ancestors had traced for hundreds of thousands of years. Orangutans, whose range today is confined to fragments of Borneo and Sumatra occupied forests across the entire shelf. Tapirs, sun bears, clouded leopards, Komodo dragons, those great monitor lizards now isolated on a handful of islands east of the Wallace Line, once ranged more widely across a connected landscape. The giant Proboscidean stegodon, an elephant relative with enormous tusks and low-crowned teeth built for browsing, had only recently vanished from the mainland after persisting in Southeast Asia for millions of years, though dwarf populations clung on in the islands of Wallacea, evolving smaller bodies in response to their shrinking worlds, a process that would become a kind of prophecy for what Sundaland's own inhabitants would face. And in the rivers, species of fish that today are found only in Borneo and only in Sumatra once swam the same water the river Threadfin, for instance. Now split between the Kapuas River on Kalimantan and the Musi and Batanghari rivers on Sumatra, separated by an ocean that used to be their shared home. Their DNA still carries the signature of that ancient connection. Their genomes remember a river that the ocean erased. This was not marginal land, not empty steppe waiting to be crossed. Sundaland, at its peak, was one of the most biodiverse environments on the planet, a tropical lowland so rich in species that 240 different tree species could occupy a single hectare of its forest. It was home to animals, to plants, and to people who had lived there for tens of thousands of years. Homo sapiens was not even the first human species to walk this ground. Homo erectus had occupied Java for more than 1 million years, among the longest tenures of any hominin outside Africa. In 2025, fossils dredged from the Madura Strait by a port construction company revealed that Homo erectus had roamed not just the island of Java, but the lowland plains of the exposed Sunda shelf itself, following the course of the Solo River across land that is now seafloor. Over 6,000 vertebrate fossils came up in that dredging stegodon and deer, water buffalo and crocodiles, and among them, fragments of a hominin skull. The answers, it turned out, were at the bottom of the sea. They had been there all along. By the time our species arrived, Sundaland had been sustaining human life for longer than any comparable landscape outside Africa. But what kind of environment was it, exactly? Here the evidence complicates the picture. For 30 years, paleoecologists have debated what the interior of Sundaland looked like during the Ice Age. One school of thought, first articulated by the biogeographer Lawrence Heaney in 1991, argues that a corridor of open savanna grassland ran north to south through the centre of the shelf, from the Malay Peninsula down through the now submerged lowlands connecting to Java. This savanna corridor, the argument goes, would have allowed grassland-dwelling species to move between mainland Asia and the southern islands, explaining certain patterns of animal distribution that are hard to account for if the entire shelf was forested. The opposing view holds that the evidence for savanna is thin. Species distribution models for over 300 dipterocarp species projected backward onto last glacial maximum climate conditions suggest that central Sundaland had suitable conditions for tropical rainforest even during the coldest periods. The dipterocarps in this model did not retreat to mountain refugia. They persisted, covering the shelf in a continuous belt of lowland forest diminished in diversity and perhaps but unbroken. Recent evidence from Sailor Cave in southern Borneo has pushed the debate further. Carbon isotope analysis of bat guano deposits, accumulated over 40,000 years, reveals that open vegetation grasslands, or savanna, did exist in at least parts of Sundaland during the last glacial period. The signal is clear at the southern equatorial end of the hypothesized corridor, where the models said only forest should be. The bats were eating insects that fed on tropical grasses. The truth, as often happens, is probably a mosaic. Some regions forested, some open, the proportions uncertain, the transitions gradual, the whole picture shifting with every century of changing rainfall and temperature. What we can say is that Sundaland was not uniform. It was a patchwork-dense tropical forest on the flanks, grassland or seasonal woodland in some interior zones, riverine forest along the great waterways, coastal mangrove and swamp forest on the margins. A world of variety mapped onto a landscape so flat that small changes in drainage or rainfall could transform a forest into a grassland or a grassland into a swamp within a few generations. And at its eastern edge, the world ended, not gradually, not in a slow thinning of land into sand and then into sea. It ended at a line, a real and physical biogeographic boundary that Alfred Russel Wallace identified in the 19th century, and that still bears his name. The Wallace Line runs between Borneo and Sulawesi, between Bali and Lombok, separating the continental shelf of Asia from the deep oceanic waters of Wallacea. Even at the lowest sea levels of the last glacial maximum, when Sundaland was fully exposed and the ocean had retreated as far as it could go, the Wallace Line remained. Deep water 70 kilometres or more of open ocean still separated Sundaland from the islands beyond. This matters enormously, because on the other side of that water lay Sahul, the combined Pleistocene landmass of Australia and New Guinea, and by at least 65,000 years ago, people had crossed it. Think about what that means. Dawn, the eastern coast of Sundaland, somewhere near what will one day be called the Makassar Strait. A group of people 30, maybe 40 crouch on a beach of dark volcanic sand where the forest meets the water. Behind them, the canopy. Ahead, the strait, grey-blue in the early light, wide enough that the far shore is not visible, just a faint darkening on the horizon that might be cloud, might be land, might be nothing. The rafts are already in the shallows. Bamboo thick columns lashed together with rattan cord, sturdy enough to carry 5 or 6 people each, buoyant enough to ride the swells that roll in from the deep channel. They have done this before. Not this crossing, not this distance, but shorter hops to islands within sight, for fishing, for foraging on beaches where shellfish cluster in the tidal rocks. They understand water, they understand current and wind, and the way a raft behaves when the waves steepen over a reef. What they are about to do is different only in degree farther and longer, out of sight of land for hours, maybe a full day, trusting that the dark shape on the horizon is solid ground, and not a trick of light on water. They push off. The bamboo flexes underfoot. The shoreline falls away. The forest shrinks to a green line, then a suggestion, then nothing. And for a span of time that no one will ever record hours, a full day, perhaps longer, they are alone on the open ocean. The first humans in history to make a crossing of this kind, paddling toward a continent that no member of their species has ever seen. The evidence from Majid Bibi Rock shelter in northern Australia, dated to approximately 65,000 years ago, tells us they made it. And the founding population was not a handful of people blown off course on a log. Genomic analysis indicates at least 4 separate mitochondrial lineages among the earliest Australians, which requires dozens of women of reproductive age, which implies a census population of hundreds. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate maritime migration across at least 8 separate water crossings through the Wallacea archipelago, the longest stretching 90 kilometres of open sea. Hundreds of people on bamboo rafts crossing deep ocean 65,000 years ago, 40,000 years before the flooding of Sundaland even began. The people who lived on this continent were not landlocked farmers waiting for the ocean to force them into boats. They were already mariners. They had been crossing deep water since before the last glacial cycle reached its peak, since before the ice sheets had finished growing, since before the rivers of the Sunda Shelf had reached their maximum extent. This is the world we need to hold in mind before we begin to drown it. Not a barren land bridge, not a place people merely crossed on their way to somewhere else. A continent, forested and rivered and inhabited, rich beyond what the modern fragmented archipelago can suggest. A homeland for animals, for plants, and for people who knew its rivers and its forests and its coastlines with the intimacy that comes from 60,000 years of occupation. The rivers are still there, traced in sonar, mapped in bathymetric data. The Molingraph, the Siam, the Malacca, the East Sundercoast rivers, flowing nowhere, carrying nothing, preserved in the topography of the seafloor like the impression of a hand in wet concrete. And along those rivers, for millennia beyond counting, people lived. They fished in the shallows. They camped on the banks. They buried their dead in the earth that would become the seabed. They shaped tools from river cobbles and carried those tools for hundreds of kilometers along corridors of water and forest that no longer exist in any form a living person can walk. But who were they? What culture did they carry? What language did they speak? What did they believe about the world that held them? The answer is less than we should know, and more than you might expect. Zoom out. Leave the forest, leave the rivers, leave the woman on the bank. Rise above the canopy until the trees are texture, until the rivers are silver threads, until the continent itself is just a green shape on a blue planet. Now speed up time. 1 year per second. Watch the coastline. Watch the ice. Watch the land appear and disappear, the ocean advancing and retreating, the shelf emerging and submerging, over and over like something breathing. At the poles, the glaciers pulse. White sheets advance and retreat across continents, locking water into ice, releasing it back into the sea, over and over, on cycles driven by the wobble of Earth's orbit. Each pulse changes the shape of every coastline on the planet. For Sundaland, sitting on its shallow shelf barely above sea level, the effect is dramatic. The land breathes. It expands as the ice grows and the oceans drop. It contracts as the ice melts and the water returns. Over the past 2 million years, the Sunda shelf has been exposed fully or partially for roughly 90% of the time. The modern condition, with Borneo and Java and Sumatra as separate islands, is the anomaly. The continent was the norm. And for all of that time, things lived there. Things walked the plains and swam the rivers and climbed the trees. And eventually, at least 50,000 years ago, probably longer, one of those things was us. But the tropics are cruel to memory. In the limestone caves of the Malay Peninsula, the remnant highlands of Sundaland's western edge archaeologists have been digging since the 1930s. The most important site is Guacher, a large rock shelter on the Nangiri River in Kellenton, first excavated by H.D. Noon before the Second World War and systematically dug by Gale Sea Viking in 1954. What Sea Viking found was a layered record of human occupation stretching back over 10,000 years. In the lower levels, unifacially flake pebble tools, waste flakes, animal bones, the debris of a hunting and gathering life. In the upper levels, polished stone axes, pottery decorated with intricate geometric patterns, jadeite bracelets buried alongside the dead. The lower levels belong to the Hoa Binh. The name comes from Hoa Binh province in northern Vietnam, where the tradition was first identified. But the Hoa Binh was not a single culture in the way we might think of one. It was a technological and subsistence pattern, a way of living in the tropical forests of Southeast Asia that persisted with regional variations for tens of thousands of years across an area stretching from southern China to the islands of Indonesia. The oldest Hoa Binh sites, push back beyond 40,000 years. The tradition endured, in some places, until 3,000 years ago, an almost inconceivable span of cultural continuity, outlasting every civilization that has existed since. The signature tool is the Sumatrelith, a river cobble flaked on one or both faces, shaped for chopping and cutting and scraping, crude by the standards of European Upper Paleolithic blades, but perfectly adapted to a world where bamboo and wood and plant fibres did most of the fine work, and stone was just the instrument that shaped them. Some sites have yielded traces of ochre, hinting at body decoration, at aesthetic and symbolic practices that leave almost no other trace. The Hoabinhian peoples used wild plants, pepper, broad beans, betel nut species that would eventually be domesticated in this same region, as though the people were rehearsing agriculture for thousands of years before committing to it. The caves keep giving up their dead. As recently as 2023, in the same Nengeri Valley where Gua Cha sits, a rescue excavation ahead of a hydroelectric dam recovered 16 more burials from 13 caves, including a complete skeleton from Gua Keladung Kesil, estimated at 14 to 16,000 years old. Over 71,000 artifacts came out of those caves. The sites will be underwater by 2027, drowned by a reservoir. The Nengeri Valley, joining Sundaland's continental shelf in the long human tradition of losing landscapes to rising water, stand in Gua Cha 10,000 years ago in the firelit interior of the shelter and watch. A woman sits cross-legged near the back wall, working a cobble against a hammerstone. The sound is rhythmic, a sharp, percussive crack followed by the lighter click of a flake falling away. She turns the cobble, finds the angle, strikes again. She is not making a blade. She is making an edge, a working surface that will last long enough to split a length of bamboo, to strip bark, to butcher the wild boar that the hunters carried in this morning. The tool does not need to be beautiful. It needs to work. Around her, the shelter is occupied. Not crowded, perhaps 8 or 10 people. A family group using this cave as they have used it for generations, returning when the forest provides and moving on when it does not. The dead are here too, buried in the floor of the shelter in flexed positions, knees drawn up, hands in front of the face, curled as if sleeping. No pottery accompanies them, no ornaments, no axes, no offerings of food in ceramic bowls. That will come later, when different people arrive with different ideas about what the dead require. For now, the Hoabinhian dead are buried simply, returned to the earth of the cave that sheltered them in life. This is what we can see. But what we cannot see, what the stone tools and the flexed burials and the animal bones cannot tell us, is who these people were in genetic terms. Where did they come from? How long had they been there? And what happened to them? For decades, those questions had no answer. The tropics destroy DNA, heat and humidity, microbial activity, the same forces that make a tropical forest so productive in life, make it ruthless in death. Bone decays. Collagen breaks down. The long chains of nucleotides that carry genetic information fragment into pieces too small to read. While ancient DNA was revolutionizing the study of human history in Europe and Central Asia, where cold, dry conditions preserved genetic material in caves, and permafrost Southeast Asia remained a blank. Then, and slowly, the picture began to change. In a clean room at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, a room with positive air pressure, UV sterilized surfaces, full-body coveralls and face shields designed to prevent a single molecule of modern DNA from contaminating the samples, researchers began extracting genetic material from the petrous bone of ancient Southeast Asian skulls. The petrous bone is the densest bone in the human body, a small, pyramid-shaped structure deep inside the skull that protects the inner ear. It is the last refuge of ancient DNA. When everything else has degraded, when the collagen has dissolved, and the bone has turned chalky, and the burial site has been flushed with 1,000 monsoons, the petrous bone sometimes still holds fragments, short and damaged, barely legible sequences. A few million base pairs where there should be 3 billion, but enough. Enough. If the techniques are sensitive enough, and the bioinformatics pipelines are powerful enough to place a person on the human family tree. The process takes months. Drilling into the petrous bone under sterile conditions, dissolving the powder in chemical baths, extracting the DNA, building libraries, sequencing the fragments, aligning them to a reference genome, filtering out the contamination. For every sample that yields usable data, dozens fail. The tropics are the worst. Failure rates in Southeast Asia dwarf those of European or Central Asian sites. Every genome recovered from this region is a small miracle of patience and technology. From Pleurfane in Laos came the DNA of a hunter-gatherer who lived approximately 8,000 years ago. From Guache itself, a genome dating to roughly 4,500 years before the present. Both were associated with the Hoabinhian tradition. Both carried a genetic signature that was startling in its implications. They were not East Asian, not in the way that the modern populations of China and Vietnam or Thailand are East Asian. They carried a deeply diverged lineage and ancestry that had split from other Asian populations tens of thousands of years earlier, a genetic signature most closely related among living peoples to the Andamanese of the Indian Ocean and to the Onge of the Andaman Islands. A lineage so old, so separate, that it predated the farming expansions, the Neolithic migrations, the entire wave of agriculturalist populations that would eventually transform the genetic landscape of Southeast Asia. These were the original inhabitants, the first layer. The people who had been there since before the ice reached its peak, since before the rivers ran their fullest, since before the name Hoabinhian existed to describe them. And then the question sharpened if this deeply diverged ancestry was the original population of Southeast Asia, what happened to it? The answer came in stages as more genomes were recovered from more sites across the region. From Manback in Vietnam, Neolithic-era individuals showed a mixture roughly 70% of their ancestry traced to farmers from the Yangtze River Valley in southern China, and roughly 30% to the older and deeper Hoabinhian-related lineage. The pattern repeated across site after site, as ancient DNA from Thailand and Myanmar and Vietnam and Indonesia told the same story in different proportions. The Neolithic revolution in Southeast Asia was not a clean replacement. It was a layering what geneticists now call the two-layer model. New people arrived, rice farmers from the Yangtze, millet cultivators from the Yellow River, pottery makers, speakers of Austroasiatic and later Tai-Kadai and Austronesian languages, and they mixed with the people who were already there. The migrations were sex-biased. Y chromosome studies show that the incoming lineages were predominantly male. The fathers came from China. The mothers, more often, were local, The old ancestry was diluted but not erased. It persists today at varying frequencies in populations across Southeast Asia. The Orang Asli of the Malay Peninsula, the indigenous peoples who still live in the highland forests, carry some of the highest proportions. The Jahai, the Temya, the Senoi, their genomes are palimpsests, modern texts written over ancient ones, the older script still partially legible beneath. In 2021, the picture extended further. From Ling Panenge, a limestone cave in South Sulawesi, not on the Sunda Shelf, but in Wallacea, the deep water island zone, beyond it came the first ancient genome recovered from that region. A young woman, buried 7,000 years ago in a hunter-gatherer context. Her DNA carrying approximately 2.2% Denisovan ancestry, more than the Hoabinhian individuals from the mainland, less than modern Papuans and Aboriginal Australians. She was a bridge genetically intermediate between the people of Sundaland and the people who had crossed to Sahol. Her genome suggested that the interbreeding with Denisovans, that ghost species of archaic humans known only from a handful of bones, and a genome had occurred somewhere in this region in or near Wallacea, in or near the crossing points, in the very waters that Sundaland's edge dwellers had been navigating for tens of thousands of years. The deep water islands were not empty when modern humans arrived. Other human species were already there, Homo floresiensis on Flores, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, possibly Denisovans on Sulawesi. The crossings were not just journeys across water, they were encounters. And, in at least some cases, those encounters left a genetic trace that persists in living people today. This is the genetic portrait of Sundaland's people, assembled from fragments and inferences, from petrous bones and population models, from the few preserved scraps of a biological record that the tropics have tried their best to erase. It is incomplete. It is provisional. It will change as more samples are recovered and more genomes sequenced. But its outlines are clear. The people of Sundaland were not a single population. They were a mosaic deep ancestry foragers in the interior, coastal mariners on the edges, groups that had been diverging and reconnecting along the rivers and coastlines for millennia. They were related to the earliest people who crossed to Australia, and they were related distantly through the deep roots of the human family tree to the Andamans, to the Orang Asli, to populations that today survive only in isolated pockets of the tropical world. They were the substrate, the foundation, the first human layer on a continent that would later receive waves of farmers, of sailors, of empire builders, each wave adding to the mix, but never fully replacing what was already there. And here is the question that follows from all of this, a question that will become central to our story in the chapters ahead. Was Sundaland merely a place these people passed through? A land bridge, a corridor, a waypoint on the journey from Africa to Australia and beyond? Or was it something more? A homeland, a place where populations grew and diversified and developed cultural traditions over tens of thousands of years. A place that, when the water came, did not simply empty, but scattered its people outward, across oceans, to islands and coastlines and continents, carrying with them genes and languages and stories that still echo in the populations of half the world. A British paediatrician named Stephen Oppenheimer, working in Malaysia and Brunei in the 1990s, came to believe it was the latter. He wrote a book about it. The book was called Eden in the East, and it changed the conversation not because everyone agreed with him, but because no one who read it could look at the map the same way again. But before we reach Oppenheimer, before we examine his argument and weigh his evidence, we need to understand what happened to the land itself. We need to watch it drown, because the drowning was not a single event. It was not a wave. It was not sudden. It was a slow and relentless, generational erasure coastlines retreating, rivers swelling, salt creeping into fresh water, forests standing in brine until they died. It happened over 13,000 years, and at one point, around 14,600 years ago, it accelerated to a pace that would have been visible within a single human lifetime. The water was coming, and the people of the drowned continent were about to discover what it means to lose a world. The drowning did not begin with a wave. It began with a taste. Salt. Faint, almost imperceptible, in the water of a river that had always been fresh. A woman crouches at the bank and cups water to her mouth the way she has done every morning of her life, and something is wrong. Not dangerous. Not alarming. Just different. A mineral edge that was not there before, a faint brine that coats the back of the tongue and lingers. She spits, tries again. The same. She looks at the river as though it might explain itself, the same brown water, the same slow current, the same reeds nodding at the margins. Everything is the same except the taste. She will not understand, in her lifetime, what that taste means. But it means this: the ocean, which has sat at the edge of the world for as long as her people's memory extends, has moved. Not by much, not visibly, but the salt is here now, in water that was fresh, and it will not leave. It will get stronger. The river mouth is widening, its current slowing, the brackish tang of the sea creeping upstream a little further each wet season. The fish will change next saltwater species appearing in estuaries that had been purely freshwater for as long as anyone could remember. The mangroves will creep inland. The beaches will move. Not dramatically, not in a way you can see from one season to the next, but across a lifetime, the way a grandparent notices what a child does not. The shoreline is retreating. This is how a continent dies. Not in catastrophe, in increments. The ice had begun to melt around 18,000 years ago, though the people living on the Sunda shelf had no way of knowing that. They could not see the Laurentide ice sheet in North America thinning at its margins, could not hear the meltwater rivers cutting through the Fennoscandian glaciers in Europe, could not feel the ocean warming by fractions of a degree in basins thousands of kilometers away. What they could feel was this: the coast was closer than it used to be. The fishing camps their grandparents had used were waterlogged, then flooded, then gone. The paths to the sea were shorter every generation. For the first 4,000 years, the rise was slow. Sea levels climbed at an average of perhaps 6 to 8 millimeters per year, less than a centimeter annually. On a shelf as flat as Sunderland's, even this gentle rate translated to significant horizontal loss. The gradient of the Sunda shelf averaged just 0.03 of a degree from coast to shelf break. On a surface that flat, a 1 meter rise in sea level could push the coastline back by kilometers. But the rate was slow enough that individual humans could adapt. Move camp. Follow the fish. Find new ground. The land was shrinking, but it was still vast, the interior plains still connected, the rivers still flowing, the mountain ranges of Borneo and Sumatra still anchoring the landscape on either side. A person born in one generation and dying in the next would have noticed the change only at the margins. The sea was a little closer. The river was a little wider near its mouth. The coastal camps were a little less permanent than they used to be. There were warnings if you knew how to read them. The freshwater lake in the Gulf of Thailand, that great interior body of water fed by rivers from every direction, was changing. Salt was entering its margins. The freshwater fish were retreating to the upper reaches. The sediments that would one day be pulled up in core samples were recording the transition in real time, layers of fresh water, clay giving way to brackish silt, the chemistry shifting, the pollens changing from forest species to mangrove and coastal scrub. The lake was becoming an estuary. The estuary would become a gulf. The gulf would become the sea. But 4,000 years of slow loss is one thing. What came next was something else entirely. 14,600 years ago, the world changed. In the space of roughly 300 years, a span so short that a grandmother could have been born in one world and died in another, sea levels rose 16 meters. The cause was the collapse of ice sheets in North America and Scandinavia, a catastrophic release of meltwater into the global ocean that scientists now call meltwater pulse. 1A, the same event that we explored earlier in this series, seen now from the other end of the world, not as a collapse of ice, but as a rising of water. The Laurentide ice sheet, which had covered most of Canada and the northern United States for tens of thousands of years, lost a volume of ice equivalent to roughly 12 meters of global sea level rise. The Fennoscandian ice sheet contributed another 4 to 5 meters. The meltwater poured into the Atlantic, raised the ocean, and the ocean came for Sundaland. 16 meters in 300 years, 40 to 60 millimeters per year, over 5 centimeters annually, a rate 20 times faster than the modern pace of sea level rise. And on the Sunda shelf, with its impossibly flat topography, the effect was devastating. Imagine a coastal settlement on the southern edge of the shelf, somewhere near the modern Natuna Islands, which at that time were not islands but low hills on a broad plain. The settlement sits on a river delta where fresh water meets the estuary, where fish are abundant, and the mangrove fringe provides shellfish and wood and shelter from storms. The people here have lived this way for generations. Their world is defined by the river, the estuary, the forest behind, and the sea ahead. In the year a woman is born, call it 14,550 years ago, the shoreline is 3 kilometers from the camp. By the time she is old enough to carry fish, it is 2. By the time she has children of her own, it is less than 1. By the time she is an elder, the camp has been moved twice inland, always inland, following the retreating ground, and each time the new site is a little higher, a little less flat, a little more hemmed in by water on the sides where land used to be. The river mouth she fished as a girl is open ocean. The delta is gone. The estuary has become a bay, and the bay is still growing. She remembers things that her grandchildren will never see. A grove of trees on a low ridge where she played as a child underwater now. The treetops long since rotted away. The ridge itself a shallow reef that the fishermen avoid because it snags their lines. A path to a neighbouring camp that used to take a half-day's walk across flat ground, now a channel, crossable only by raft. The camps on either side growing more distant with each passing year. The dead are underwater too. The places where her mother's mother was buried, the places where the old ones said the spirits lived, the sea does not care about the dead. It takes the graves the same way it takes the paths and the fishing grounds and the groves. Impartially, completely, without stopping, she is not watching a flood. She is watching an erasure. And the worst part, the part that separates this from every other natural disaster that humans have endured, is that it does not stop. A flood recedes. A fire burns out. A drop breaks. A volcano erupts, and then it is silent. But the ocean, once it takes ground, does not give it back. The water comes, and it stays, and next year there is a little more of it, and the year after that a little more, and the process has no end that anyone alive can see. There is no rebuilding, there is no recovery, there is only retreat, and the knowledge unspoken, and perhaps, but present in every generation's awareness of how the world has changed since the elders were young, that the retreat will not stop either. Extinction of a homeland does not look like a catastrophe. It looks like a series of small surrenders, a camp abandoned, a path submerged, a fishing ground lost, each one and individually survivable. Together, across generations, they add up to the disappearance of a world. This is what Meltwater Pulse 1A looked like from the ground. Not a wall of water, not a tsunami, a slow and relentless, generational theft of everything solid underfoot, and the evidence suggests that the people knew. Not as science, they could not have understood the glaciology or the orbital mechanics, but as experience. A 2023 study in communications biology, integrating paleogeographic mapping with whole genome sequencing of 763 individuals from 59 ethnic groups across Southeast and South Asia, found that the rapid sea level rises of MWP1A and MWP1B directly corresponded to population segregation events. The flooding physically separated communities that had been connected by land. Gene flow ceased between groups that had been in contact for millennia, and in some cases, population pressure from the shrinking land drove migration, the earliest documented instance of forced human displacement caused by sea level rise. The land area of Sundaland was cut by more than half between the last glacial maximum and the mid-Holocene. A continent of nearly 2 million square kilometers shrank in 13,000 years to the scattered archipelago we see today. The loss was not uniform. It came in pulses MWP1A at 14,600 years ago, a slower rise during the Younger Dryas cold reversal between 12,900 and 11,800 years ago, then MWP1B around 11,500 years ago, each pulse racing another swath of coastal plain, drowning another river system, cutting another connection between populations. The Younger Dryas offered a reprieve. For roughly 1,000 years, a cold snap possibly triggered by the same meltwater that was drowning Sundaland re-rotted into the North Atlantic and disrupting ocean circulation, the same catastrophic disruption we traced in an earlier episode of this series slowed the rise. The sea paused, the coastlines stabilized briefly, and then the warmth returned and MWP1B struck and the drowning resumed. The people of Sundaland had 1,000 years to catch their breath. Then the water came again. Each pulse redrew the map. The connections between landmasses snapped one by one, like threads being cut. Borneo, which had been connected to the Malay Peninsula by a broad land bridge for 100,000 years, was severed. Java, which had been the southern edge of a continent, became the southern edge of nothing an island, surrounded by water, its northern coast facing an ocean that had been a forest floor within the memory of the community's oldest stories. Now step back. Rise above it. Watch the drowning from orbit, the way we watched the ice breathe at the beginning of the last chapter. Speed up time again 1 year per second. The view from above. The shelf is green, laced with rivers, flat and enormous. The ocean surrounds it on 3 sides, dark blue deepening to black at the continental margins. Now the water begins to rise. The green fringe at the edges darkens, turns brown, turns blue. The coastline crawls inward. The rivers shorten as the sea overtakes their lower reaches. Deltas vanish. Estuaries widen. The great Paleo Lake in the Gulf of Thailand, that freshwater body ringed by forest, the one whose sediments recorded the transition from lake to sea, fills with salt. It is no longer a lake. It is a gulf, and it is growing. The southern plains go first. The broad, flat expanses between Java and Borneo, the floor of what will become the Java Sea, disappear beneath shallow water. Borneo separates from Sumatra. The Malacca Strait opens, a channel of seawater cutting between landmasses that had been joined for 100,000 years. Sumatra separates from the Malay Peninsula. Java separates from Borneo. One by one, the connections break. The continent fractures into pieces. The pieces become islands. The islands shrink. By 8,000 years ago, the map of Southeast Asia looks roughly as it does today. The drowning is essentially complete. The final remnants of the exposed shelf, the shallow banks, the sandbars, the last low ridges slip beneath the surface. The South China Sea fills to its modern extent. The Java Sea stabilizes. The Strait of Malacca, fully open, begins to carry the currents that will one day make it the most important shipping lane in Asia. Stand on one of those last ridges 8,000 years ago. A hill in what will become the Natuna Islands, a cluster of granite peaks rising from the shelf, surrounded on all sides by sea that was land within living memory. The hill is crowded now, not with people, though there are people here, a small community clinging to the high ground, but with forest, compressed into a shrinking footprint. Species that once ranged across a continent packed into a few hundred hectares of remaining land. The trees grow close. The animal calls are louder here than they should be. The density of life artificially concentrated by the rising water that has pushed everything uphill. From the summit, on a clear day, you can see in every direction. Water, blue-grey and flat, endless. No land on any horizon. To the south, where your grandfather said there were plains that took days to cross, there is nothing. To the east, where the river used to flow the Great Molengraaf, the spine of the continent there is only a shimmer of shallow sea, the water too clear for its depth, the pale sand of the drowned riverbed visible through the surface like a scar. This is the last of Sundaland, these hilltops, these islands in the making. Everything below you is gone. What is left are the mountain tops. Borneo and Sumatra, Java the highland cores of a drowned continent, rising above the new sea like the upper floors of a submerged building. Every island in Indonesia today is a peak. Every strait is a drowned valley. Every shallow sea is a former plain. The geography of modern Southeast Asia is not a natural arrangement of land and water. It is a wound. It is the scar left by 13,000 years of flooding, written across 1 million square kilometers of ocean. And the people on those shrinking islands, the descendants of the woman on the riverbank, the grandchildren of the Hoabinhian toolmakers, the inheritors of 60,000 years of continuous occupation, faced a choice that no previous generation of humans had ever confronted on this scale. Stay and accept a world that gets smaller every year, or leave. Take to the water, build boats, learn currents, read the stars, and go. This was not unique to Sundaland. On the other side of the world, in the North Sea basin, another continent was drowning at the same time. Doggerland, the land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, was undergoing the same process: slow submersion, river drowning, population displacement. The people of Doggerland walked away and inland, absorbed into the populations of rising Britain and the European coast. But the scale was different. Doggerland was a peninsula. Sundaland was a continent, and the people of Sundaland, unlike the people of Doggerland, had been building boats for 40,000 years before the water forced them to use them for survival. Some stayed. The Orang Asli retreated into the highland forests of the Malay Peninsula, carrying their deep ancestry into the interior, where it persists today. The Jahai, the Temia, the Sonoy, living in the mountains with genomes that still whisper of the drowned lowlands their ancestors left behind. Populations fragmented, isolated on islands that had been hilltops, losing contact with communities they had been connected to for millennia. Genetic diversity narrowed. Languages diverged. The Malayan tapir, whose ancestors had roamed from the Malay Peninsula to Sumatra across continuous land, saw its population split by the opening of the Malacca Strait, the animals on either side of the new water diverging, their effective population size crashing from 12,000 to fewer than 2,000, the genetic bottleneck of a drowned continent written into the DNA of every surviving tapir. What happened to the tapir happened to everything, including the people. But others left, and what they did, where they went, what they carried, and what they became is a story that begins with a single controversial question: was Sundaland not just a homeland lost, but a homeland that seeded the world? A British paediatrician working in the tropics thought the answer was yes. His name was Stephen Oppenheimer, and the book he wrote about it would reframe the entire conversation about who the people of Southeast Asia really are. Stephen Oppenheimer was not an archaeologist. He was not a linguist, not a geologist, not a population geneticist, at least not by training. He was a paediatrician, a British doctor specializing in tropical medicine who had spent decades working in Malaysia and Nepal, Papua New Guinea, and Brunei, treating children in the equatorial heat, while quietly assembling a theory that would unsettle the foundations of Southeast Asian prehistory. It began with blood. In the early 1980s, while working in New Guinea, Oppenheimer was the first to notice that alpha thalassemia, a mild, inherited blood disorder, conferred protection against malaria in the populations he was treating. The genetic disorder shadowed the movement of peoples across the Pacific. It was a clue, written in hemoglobin, that human migration left traces not just in stone tools and pottery, but in the living bodies of the descendants. Oppenheimer followed the clue. He moved from clinical medicine into genetic research, and from genetic research into the deep history of the people among whom he had spent his career. By the mid-1990s, working in Brunei as a senior specialist pediatrician. He was looking at mitochondrial DNA data from Malay populations and finding something that didn't fit the standard story. Picture him in those years, a British doctor in his late 40s, working in a small, wealthy sultanate on the northern coast of Borneo, an island that 20,000 years ago was not an island at all, but a mountain range at the center of a continent. He is surrounded by the descendants of the people whose history he is trying to reconstruct. He sees them in his clinic, treats their children, learns their languages, absorbs their stories, and in the evenings he reads genetics papers, linguistics journals, geological surveys of the Sunda Shelf, assembling a picture that no single discipline had put together. The standard story at that time said that the peoples of islands Southeast Asia, the Malays, the Javanese, the Filipinos, the Polynesians were descended from rice farmers who had migrated south from China through Taiwan roughly 6,000 years ago. This was the Out of Taiwan hypothesis, built on powerful linguistic evidence assembled by Robert Blust and archaeological evidence championed by Peter Bellwood. It was elegant. It was well supported. And Oppenheimer thought it was missing something enormous. The mtDNA lineages he was seeing in the Malay populations were old, far older than 6,000 years. Some of the maternal lineages in Peninsular Malaysian Malays traced not to Taiwan, not to China, but deep into the Sunda Shelf itself, genetic signatures that appeared to have been in place for tens of thousands of years, predating the Neolithic, predating agriculture, predating the Austronesian expansion entirely. If the Out of Taiwan model was the whole story, where were these ancient lineages coming from? In 1998, Oppenheimer published his answer. The book was called Eden in the East, the drowned continent of Southeast Asia, and its argument was sweeping and ambitious, and exactly the kind of thing that makes mainstream scientists uncomfortable. It synthesized work across half a dozen disciplines: oceanography and archaeology and linguistics, social anthropology, human genetics into a single narrative, the kind of boundary-crossing synthesis that specialists in any one field tend to distrust, partly because it trespasses on their territory, and partly because the wider the synthesis, the harder it is to get every detail right. Sundaland, Oppenheimer argued, was not merely a land bridge that people crossed on their way to somewhere else. It was a homeland, a rich and tropical, resource-laden continent where human populations had grown and diversified for tens of thousands of years. And when the seas rose and the continent drowned, particularly during the catastrophic flooding pulses between 14,000 and 7,000 years ago, those populations did not simply disappear. They dispersed outward in every direction, into the highlands that became the modern islands of Indonesia and Malaysia, into the Pacific, carrying the seafaring skills they had been developing since before the last glacial maximum, westward, possibly as far as India, even Mesopotamia. This was the Out of Sundaland Theory, and its boldest claim was this: the great cultures that emerged in the Neolithic, the rice cultivators, the potters, the navigators, the Austronesian speakers who populated half the Pacific, did not originate in China and spread south. They originated in Sundaland and spread outward, pushed by the drowning of their homeland, carrying with them the seeds of maritime civilization. Oppenheimer built his case across four pillars: genetics and archaeology, and linguistics and mythology. The genetic pillar rested on mitochondrial DNA. Oppenheimer pointed to maternal lineages in Southeast Asian populations that showed deep local roots lineages that appeared to have diversified in situ on the Sunda Shelf long before any Neolithic migration from China. He argued that the Out of Taiwan model accounted for only a superficial layer of genetic ancestry in island Southeast Asia, and that the deeper, older substrate, the Hoabinhian related ancestry we traced in the previous chapter, was the real foundation. The farmers from China, in his view, were latecomers who mixed with populations that had been thriving in Sundaland for millennia. The archaeological pillar drew on the evidence of early maritime capability. The Wallacea crossing, which we have already traced, proved that Sundaland's people could build boats and navigate open ocean by at least 65,000 years ago. If they had that capability before the Ice Age even peaked, what were they doing with it during the 13,000 years of flooding that followed? Oppenheimer argued they were dispersing systematically, strategically, following coastlines, island hopping, carrying knowledge of tides and currents refined across tens of thousands of years of coastal living. The linguistic pillar was more contentious. Oppenheimer suggested that the Austronesian languages, the vast family that stretches from Madagascar to Easter Island, might have deeper roots in Sundaland than the Out of Taiwan model allowed. He did not reject the role of Taiwan entirely, but he proposed that the linguistic diversity of the region reflected a more complex history than a single north to south migration could explain. Some languages, he argued, might represent substrate tongues from the pre-flooding population, later overlaid by Austronesian speakers arriving from the north. The mythological pillar was the most provocative. Oppenheimer collected flood myths from across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, noting structural similarities that he argued could not be coincidence. In Vietnam alone, the folklorist Dang Nung Guiem Van had collected 307 flood myths in field research during the early 1990s. Virtually every ethnic group in mainland Southeast Asia told a version of the same story, a great deluge. Two survivors, sometimes siblings, sometimes a woman and a dog, the reconstitution of humanity, often from a gourd or a gourd-shaped lump of flesh that becomes the source of all ethnic groups. The motif recurred across the Philippines, across Indonesia, across the Pacific Islands, with local variations, but a shared structural skeleton that Oppenheimer argued was too specific, too consistent to be explained by coincidence or by borrowing from the Near East. He proposed that these were cultural memories, fragments of a real event, the drowning of Sundaland, preserved in oral tradition across thousands of years and carried outward by the dispersing populations. The flood, in Oppenheimer's reading, was not Noah's flood. It was the flooding of the Sunda Shelf, and the stories about it were the oldest continuous oral records of a geological event in human history. Evidence from Aboriginal Australia lent plausibility to this claim. Researchers had documented Aboriginal oral traditions that appeared to preserve specific geographical details of sea level changes from over 7,000 years ago, details that aligned with known post-Ice Age coastal configurations. If Australian oral tradition could maintain such records across 7 millennia, could Southeast Asian traditions have done the same? Eden in the East was widely read. It was reviewed in science. It inspired 2 television documentaries, The Real Eve on the Discovery Channel and Out of Eden on Channel 4. And it provoked exactly the reaction you would expect from the academic establishment: admiration for its ambition, skepticism about its reach. The critiques came from every direction. Linguists were the most direct. Robert Blust, the architect of the Out of Taiwan model, and his colleagues pointed out that the linguistic evidence for a Taiwan origin of the Austronesian language family was overwhelming. 9 out of 10 primary subgroups of Austronesian are found only in Taiwan, a distribution that, by standard methods of historical linguistics, points firmly to Taiwan as the homeland. The principle is called the center of gravity model. The area of greatest diversity of a language family is probably its point of origin, because the longer a language has been diversifying in a place, the more branches it will have generated there. By that measure, Taiwan wins convincingly. All of the rest of the Austronesian world, from the Philippines to Polynesia to Madagascar, one of the most widely distributed language families on Earth, fits within a single subgroup, Malayo-Polynesian. That is just one of Taiwan's 10 primary branches. The Out of Sundaland model offered no linguistic mechanism that could account for this pattern. Oppenheimer's suggestion of substrate languages was interesting but unsubstantiated. There was no reconstructed proto-language for a Sundaland origin family, no systematic sound correspondences, no comparative morphology. The linguistic evidence, and bluntly, offered no support for an Out of Sundaland origin of the Austronesian languages. Geneticists pushed back more carefully. Oppenheimer's original genetic arguments rested heavily on mitochondrial DNA, a single, maternally inherited marker that captures only one line of descent. As a tool, it is powerful but partial. It tells you about mothers and their mothers and their mothers before them. It says nothing about fathers, and it can be misleading when populations mix, because a small number of incoming males with high reproductive success can reshape a population's autosomal ancestry without leaving much trace in the maternal line. Whole genome studies, which became available in the 2010s, painted a more complex picture. They confirmed the deep pre-Neolithic ancestry that Oppenheimer had identified. The Hoabinhian-related substrate was real, and it was old, and it was widespread. But they also confirmed substantial genetic input from East Asia during the Neolithic, arriving via Taiwan and the Philippines, exactly as the Out of Taiwan model predicted. The 2018 study, led by Hugh McColl at the University of Copenhagen, analysing ancient DNA from 18 Southeast Asian individuals spanning 4,000 years, found that early Neolithic farmers at Man Bac in Vietnam carried a mixture of roughly 70% East Asian Yangtze-derived ancestry and 30% deep Hoabinhian related ancestry, a ratio that was replicated across site after site. More recently, a comprehensive Y chromosome study analysing over 1,500 high-coverage sequences from ethnolinguistically diverse groups identified multiple male biased expansions from South China into Southeast Asia, directly linked to the spread of Austronesian, Tai Kadai, and Hmong-Mien languages. The paternal gene flow was substantial, male-driven, and tied to specific Neolithic cultural innovations. The fathers, and overwhelmingly, came from the north. The mothers, more often, were local. This sex bias pattern was precisely the kind of signal that Oppenheimer's mtDNA-only approach would have missed. The maternal lineages could look old and local, while the autosomal genome told a story of significant admixture. genome-wide analysis of over 1,000 modern individuals from across Southeast Asia and the Pacific supported a model in which the ancestors of today's Austronesian speakers diverged from Taiwanese indigenous peoples around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. The deep ancestry was there, but so was the Neolithic layer, and the Neolithic layer was associated specifically with the spread of Austronesian languages, rice cultivation, and pottery traditions. The mythological argument drew the sharpest fire. In 2007, at an International Association for Comparative Mythology conference in Edinburgh, the Dutch mythologist Wim van Binsbergen presented a paper directly challenging Oppenheimer's use of Southeast Asian flood myths as evidence for Sundaland origin dispersal. Van Binsbergen argued that the flood myth motifs Oppenheimer cited were widely distributed across cultures with no connection to Sundaland, that the structural similarities were better explained by universal human responses to living near water than by cultural transmission from a single source, and that the chain of oral transmission Oppenheimer proposed thousands of years across ocean migrations was archaeologically unprecedented and empirically unverifiable. Oppenheimer's broader claims that Sundaland's culture may have influenced Mesopotamia and India, that the Neolithic revolution might have originated there, faced similar resistance. The evidence for early rice cultivation points firmly to the Yangtze River Valley in China, not to Southeast Asia. The archaeological record of Mesopotamian and Indus Valley civilizations shows no clear material connection to Southeast Asian traditions. The idea of a founding civilization emanating from Sundaland was compelling as a narrative, but unsupported by the kind of specific, falsifiable evidence that mainstream archaeology demands. And yet, Oppenheimer's core insight, the one that even his critics generally acknowledge was sound. The deep, pre-Neolithic ancestry of Southeast Asian populations is real. It is not a relic or a footnote. It is the foundation on which everything else was built. The Hoabinhian-related lineages that Oppenheimer identified in the 1990s have been confirmed by every subsequent wave of ancient DNA research. The people of Sundaland were not passive recipients of culture from the north. They were an established, deep-rooted population with tens of thousands of years of in-situ development, maritime capability, and ecological knowledge. Their ancestry persists at measurable frequencies in virtually every population in modern Southeast Asia, from the Orang Asli of the Malay interior to the Javanese to the indigenous peoples of the Philippines. The deep layer is always there, beneath the Neolithic, beneath the Austronesian, beneath the Indianized empires and the Islamic sultanates and the colonial overlays of the last 5 centuries. The oldest stratum, the first inhabitants, and Oppenheimer was right about something else that mattered. The drowning was not merely a geographical event. It was a human catastrophe with demographic consequences that remain legible in the genomes of living people. The most comprehensive genetic analysis to date, that 2023 Communications Biology study integrating paleogeographic mapping with 763 whole genomes, confirmed that sea level rise from MWP1A and MWP1B physically separated Sundaland's populations and triggered migration. Events that reshaped the genetic landscape of South and Southeast Asia. The study documented the earliest known instance of forced human migration driven by sea level rise populations of Malaysian negritos pushed into South Asia by the flooding, carrying their Sundaland ancestry into a new continent. The drowning was not an abstraction. It was a demographic engine. It moved people, and those people carried their ancestry and their stories into the world. Where does that leave us? Not with a winner and a loser. Not with Out of Taiwan defeating Out of Sundaland, or vice versa. The truth, as best as the evidence currently supports it, is layered. The deep ancestry of Southeast Asia's populations is local rooted in Sundaland and its surroundings stretching back tens of thousands of years. The Austronesian languages and their associated Neolithic cultural package rice and pottery, polished stone tools came later from the north through Taiwan around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Both layers are real. Both matter. The question is not which model is correct, but how the layers interacted. Oppenheimer pushed too far in some directions. His maximalist claims Sundaland as the cradle of civilization, the source of Mesopotamian culture outran the evidence. But his central provocation remains: we cannot understand Southeast Asia by looking only at the last 6,000 years. The region's history begins not with the Neolithic, but with the Pleistocene. Not with rice, but with rivers. Not with Taiwan, but with the drowned continent that lies beneath the sea. There is something to be said for being usefully wrong. Oppenheimer was wrong about the Austronesian homeland. He was wrong about the reach of Sundaland's cultural influence. He was probably wrong about the flood myths as direct cultural transmission, but he was right about the thing that mattered most, that the people of Sundaland were not footnotes in someone else's migration story. They were the story's first chapter, the substrate, the foundation, the deep layer beneath the Neolithic veneer, and the drowning of their homeland was not an irrelevance. It was a demographic engine that reshaped the human geography of an entire hemisphere. The irony is that Oppenheimer, the outsider, the pediatrician who wandered into prehistory through the side door of tropical medicine, may have been closer to the truth than his credentials would suggest, not in his conclusions, which overreached, but in his instinct that something vast and important had happened on the Sunda Shelf, something that the standard narratives of Southeast Asian history had failed to account for, something that the ocean was still hiding. The argument is unresolved. It may remain unresolved until, if we can excavate the Sunda Shelf itself, until the tools and the camps and the art of the drowned continent are pulled from the mud and the silt and the 40 meters of ocean that cover them, until the evidence speaks for itself rather than being reconstructed from fragments scattered across 1,000 islands. That excavation has barely begun, but the technology is arriving, and what it has revealed already is extraordinary. The ping takes 0.05 seconds to reach the bottom and return. In that fraction of a moment, less time than it takes to blink, a pulse of sound leaves the hull mounted transducer, travels 40 meters through warm, murky water, strikes the seafloor of the South China Sea, and bounces back. The returning signal carries information: the shape of the bottom, its hardness, its texture, the angle of its surfaces. A computer assembles the returns thousands per second, millions per survey into an image. And the image, when it resolves on the screen in the ship's control room, shows something that should not exist in the middle of an ocean. On deck, the sea is flat. Green, grey, and opaque, stretching to every horizon. Tankers pass in the distance. This is one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth, the South China Sea, carrying a quarter of the world's trade across water that is, in many places, barely deep enough to drown in. Below the hull, the depth gauge reads 38 meters. Shallow. Absurdly shallow for an ocean. And the screen shows why. A river channel. Clear and sinuous, deeply incised into the shelf sediment, following the same meandering logic that every tropical river on Earth follows, bending toward the lower ground, finding the path of least resistance, carrying water that has not flowed here for 8,000 years. The channel branches. Tributaries join from the east, from the west, converging into a main stem that runs north-northeast toward the shelf edge. Where it once emptied into the sea through a massive delta, the delta is there too, visible in the sonar data as a fan of sediment spreads on the upper continental slope, the ghost of a river mouth that once discharged freshwater into the South China Sea from a catchment area the size of a European nation. This is the Molengraaff River, or rather, this is its corpse, a topographic imprint preserved in the seafloor, mapped for the first time in coarse detail by GAF. Molengraaff himself in 1921, when the Dutch geologist looked at depth soundings from the South China Sea and realized that the shallow contours followed the pattern of a river system. He published his hypothesis with his colleague Max Weber beneath the sea, a continental drainage network. It took decades for the technology to prove him right. Harold Voris refined the river maps in 2000 using improved bathymetric data. Sathyamurthy and Voris added further detail in 2006. And now, with the GEBCO 2025 global bathymetric dataset and high-resolution sonar surveys that can distinguish features as small as individual channel meanders, the rivers of Sundaland are visible in extraordinary clarity. The Molengraaff is dead, but it is not gone. Its form is written into the earth beneath the sea the way a fossil is written into rock, compressed and buried, but structurally intact. And it is not alone. 6 major paleo river systems have now been identified and mapped across the Sunda Shelf. The Molengraaff and the Siam, the Malacca and the East Sunda, plus 2 additional systems resolved by the latest digital elevation models. Between them, a vast paleo lake in the Gulf of Thailand, a freshwater body that sediment cores have confirmed existed for thousands of years before the sea overtopped it. The drainage architecture of an entire continent reconstructed from the topography of a seafloor that most people think of as flat and featureless and empty. It is none of those things. In 2000, Till Hannebeth and his team from the University of Bremen conducted one of the most detailed investigations of the Sunda Shelf ever attempted aboard the German research vessel Son. On cruise 115, they ran a transect of air gun and PARSOUND seismic profiles across the northern shelf, directly over the Molengraaff Paleo Delta. They recovered 36 sediment cores from water depths between 70 and 126 meters, each core a vertical column of time, a cross-section through the shelf's history, readable layer by layer. The cores told a story. Hold one in your hands, a plastic tube, 2 meters long, pulled dripping from the seafloor, laid out on the deck of the Son, while the tropical sun beats down and the sea rocks gently beneath the hull. Slice it open lengthwise. Inside, the colours change from bottom to top like a geological sunset. At the bottom, dark brown. Terrestrial deposits. River silt. The pollen is there if you look under a microscope, grains from freshwater plants, from dipterocarp trees, from grasses. Organic material with carbon isotope signatures consistent with a land's surface. This was the world before the flood, the continent, and dry and vegetated, inhabited. You can touch it. You can hold the mud of a drowned continent in your palm. Above it, a transitional zone. The colour shifts to grey-brown. Brackish sediments, estuarine chemistry. The pollen shifts from forest species to mangrove and coastal scrub. This was the drowning in progress, the moment when the rising sea reached this particular point on the shelf and the freshwater world began to die. You can see the transition. It is not gradual. In some cores, the shift from terrestrial to marine happens within centimetres, a few centuries of geological time, compressed into a handspan of mud, and above that pale grey to blue, full marine sediments, sand and silt, shell fragments. Ocean, the drowning complete. 80 AMS radiocarbon dates pinned the sequence to a timeline. The terrestrial layers at the base of the cores dated to the last glacial maximum and the early deglaciation. The transitional zone, the death of the land, aligned precisely with meltwater pulse 1A. 14,600 to 14,300 years ago, the marine cap was Holocene. The entire sequence was their continent and transition and ocean, written in mud and measured in centuries. It was this data from Hannibeth's Son cruise that produced one of the key sea level records for MWP1A. The Sunda Shelf, precisely because it is so flat and so tectonically stable, turned out to be an ideal recorder of sea level change. The same characteristics that made the flooding so devastating for the people who lived there, the shallow depth, the low gradient, the enormous horizontal retreat per metre of vertical rise, made the sedimentary record extraordinarily sensitive. Every pulse of sea level rise was captured in the layers. The shelf was not just a victim of the drowning, it was its witness. But sediment cores and sonar maps, for all their power, are limited. They tell us about the physical landscape, the rivers, the coastlines, the vegetation, the chemistry of the water. They do not tell us, and directly, about the people. For that, we need artifacts, and artifacts on the Sunda Shelf are actually rare. The problem is preservation. The same warm and shallow, biologically active tropical waters that make the Sunda Shelf so productive for marine life make it hostile to archaeological material. Stone tools survive, but they are small, easily buried, and nearly impossible to distinguish from natural rocks using sonar alone. Organic materials, bone and wood and fibre, shall degrade rapidly in the marine environment. Sediment covers everything. Tidal currents disturb the upper layers, and the sheer scale of the search area, over 1 million square kilometres of shallow sea, makes systematic survey almost impossibly expensive. Some finds have come through, despite everything. Stone tools and faunal remains have been recovered from shallow marine sediments off the coasts of Borneo and Java, though many of these were found not by archaeologists, but by fishermen, pulled up in trawl nets, washed out of eroding seabed, handed to researchers years after recovery with the precise location forgotten or only vaguely remembered. This is the archaeology of accident, not design. It tells us that artifacts exist on the shelf. It does not tell us where they sit in the sedimentary sequence, what surrounded them, what story they belong to. A stone tool without its context is a sentence without a paragraph, meaningful in isolation, but stripped of the narrative that gives it weight. In 2015, a port construction company dredging sand from the Madura Strait to build an artificial island off the coast of Java, accidentally pulled up over 6,000 vertebrate fossils from the seafloor, including, as we noted earlier, fragments of a Homo erectus skull. The fossils came from the sandy fill of a Lowston valley of the Solo River, now submerged, dating to roughly 160,000 years ago. The discovery was extraordinary, the first direct evidence of hominin presence on the submerged Sunda shelf. But it was also a cautionary tale. The fossils were recovered from dredge fill, not from controlled excavation. Their precise stratigraphic context was lost. The information they could have yielded about the exact environment, the ecology, the behavior of the people and animals who lived on the drowned plains was diminished, though not destroyed by the circumstances of their recovery. This is the central frustration of Sundaland archaeology. We know the landscape is there. We can map it, we can date it, we can reconstruct its rivers and its coastlines and its vegetation from sonar and sediment cores and pollen analysis. We can trace the exact course of the Mullingraf River, the river our woman walked along in the opening of this story, the river that flowed through the heart of the continent, and we can show it on a screen with a resolution that would let you see individual meanders. But the human story, the camps, the hearths, the middens, the burial sites, the tools, the art, if there was art, remains largely inaccessible. It is buried under meters of marine sediment, in shallow seas churned by monsoon tides, in waters where visibility can drop to zero and currents can sweep a diver off a site in seconds. The continent is mapped. Its people are ghosts. Efforts are underway. An Australian husband and wife team of marine archaeologists, Hans and Rose Berrakoven, have spent years conducting sonar surveys from their ketch-rigged motor Sailor Southern Sun, working out of Miri in Sarawak, scanning the Rajang River extension near the Laconia Shoals for evidence of submerged habitation sites. Their work, part of the broader Sunda Shelf Archaeology project, represents one of the few systematic attempts to search for prehistoric human sites on the drowned shelf. The results so far are promising but preliminary. The sonar can identify features of potential interest, but confirming them requires diving and coring and excavation, all of which demand time and funding and favourable conditions that are rarely available simultaneously. In Australia, the challenge has been met with more success, and the comparison is instructive. Off the coast of Murujuga in Western Australia, a team from Flinders University used LiDAR-mounted aircraft and sonar-equipped boats to identify submerged sites, then sent divers to survey them. At Cape Brughere's channel, they discovered 269 stone artefacts under about 2.5 meters of water, the first confirmed submerged Aboriginal archaeological site on the Australian continental shelf. The artefacts were 7,000 years old, preserved in a channel environment that had protected them from wave action and sediment disturbance. The key was the channel. The stones had settled into a natural trap, a narrow, sheltered passage between rock formations where tidal currents were weak enough to allow sedimentation, but strong enough to keep the artifacts from being buried too deeply. The archaeologists knew what to look for, not open-seabed, which is too exposed, but enclosed environments, channels, and embayments. The lee sides of submerged ridges, where the physics of the marine environment might accidentally replicate the conditions of a terrestrial site. if similar preservation conditions exist on the Sunda Shelf, and given its enormous area, the probability is high that they do then, the tools of Sundaland's people may still be down there, in the drowned meanders of the Mollingruff River, in the sediment-filled channels between submerged hilltops, in the protected embayments of what are now shallow reefs, waiting, the way all buried archaeology waits patiently and silently for someone to come looking with the right tools and the right questions. The technology is closing in. High-resolution bathymetric mapping, sub-bottom profiling, autonomous underwater vehicles, and increasingly sophisticated machine learning algorithms for identifying human-modified objects in sonar data are all advancing rapidly. The day may come not tomorrow, but perhaps within a generation, when the first prehistoric site on the drowned Sunda Shelf is excavated in situ, its artifacts catalogued, its stratigraphy recorded, its story told. When that day comes, it will rewrite the history of Southeast Asia, not because it will prove or disprove Oppenheimer's theory, or validate one migration model over another, but because it will give a voice to a continent that has been silent for 8,000 years. It will show us what the people of Sundaland built, and made, and believed, in their own material culture, in their own archaeological record, rather than in the fragmentary genetic and linguistic inferences we are forced to rely on today. Consider what might be there. Hobinhian camps on riverbanks, their Sumatralith tools scattered across occupation floors, the way they were left when the last inhabitant walked inland ahead of the rising water, middens of freshwater shellfish, preserving the diet and the seasons of a vanished world. Hearths with charcoal that could be radiocarbon, dated to the century. Burial sites bodies in the flexed position, knees to chin, the posture of the Hoabinhian dead interred in the soil of a continent that is now the seafloor of the Java Sea, perhaps even art. Rock shelters on the now submerged flanks of Sundaland's mountains may have carried paintings or engravings that survive beneath the marine sediment, protected by the same accidental burial that preserved the river channels. We do not know. We cannot know until we look. Until then, we have the rivers on the sonar screen. We have the sediment cores. We have the ghost of a continent, mapped in extraordinary detail, its outlines clear, its interior still dark. We have the knowledge that beneath the shipping lanes and the fishing grounds and the oil rigs of the South China Sea and the Java Sea, beneath the warm green water that tankers cross every day without a thought for what lies below, there is a world, a drowned world, complete with rivers and lakes and forests and the traces of human life stretching back 100,000 years or more. It is the largest underwater archaeological site on Earth, and it has barely been touched. And we have the stories, the flood myths of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, told by the descendants of the people who watched the water come. Whether those stories are memories or metaphors or something in between is a question that brings us to the final chapter of our journey. Night. A village in the highlands of Luzon, in the northern Philippines, high enough above the coast that the sea is invisible, but close enough that you can smell the salt on the wind when the monsoon turns. A fire burns in the center of a cleared space between wooden houses raised on stilts. The flame is low embers more than blaze, the kind of fire that has been burning all evening, tended by someone who adds a stick, when the light dims and lets it settle when the light is enough. Children sit cross-legged in a half-circle, their faces lit in amber and shadow. Behind them, the adults' parents and aunts, older siblings sit or stand at the edge of the light, listening with the particular attention of people who have heard this story before and know that hearing it again is the point. An elder speaks. His voice is unhurried. He has told this story 100 times and will tell it 100 more. The story goes like this, and it has gone like this for as long as anyone in this village can remember, and their parents before them, and their parents before them, back through a chain of voices that no one has counted and no one can count. There was a time when the water rose. It rose and rose, and it did not stop. The people fled to the high ground. Some climbed the mountains, some took to boats. But the water was patient, and it followed them, and the land that their ancestors had known, the flat land, the river land, the land of fish and forest, disappeared beneath the sea. Only the mountains remained, and from the mountains the people looked down at an ocean where their homeland had been, and they told this story so that their children would know what was lost. The details vary. In some versions, the flood is punishment, the gods are angry, a taboo has been broken, an animal has been mocked in a way that the spirits cannot forgive. In other versions, there is no cause given at all. The water simply comes. Two survivors, sometimes a brother and sister, sometimes a man and a dog, sometimes a woman and a stranger, rebuild the world from what remains. In many versions across mainland Southeast Asia, the survivors produce a gourd, and from the gourd come all the ethnic groups of the region, each emerging with their own language, their own customs, their own portion of the new world that has replaced the drowned one. 307 flood myths were collected by the Vietnamese folklorist Dang Ninh Van in field research during the early 1990s. 307 from virtually every ethnic group in mainland Southeast Asia. The Hmong have one. The Thai have one. The Khmer, the Vietnamese, the Lao, the Cham, the Iban of Borneo, the Tagalog of the Philippines, the Maori of New Zealand. Across the entire Austronesian world and deep into the Austroasiatic-speaking mainland, the story of a great flood is one of the most persistent, most widely distributed narrative motifs in human culture. The question is whether these stories remember something real. The orthodox view in folklore studies has long been skeptical. Flood myths are universal. The argument goes found in Mesopotamia, in Greece, in the Hebrew Bible, in China, in the Americas, in cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Their ubiquity suggests not a single historical event, but a universal human experience living near water, being flooded and surviving, and telling the story. Rivers overflow, coastlines change, tsunamis strike. Every culture near water has a reason to tell a flood story, and the structural similarities, the survivors, the vessel, the reconstitution of humanity reflect deep narrative universals, not shared history. This is a reasonable position. It may be correct. But there are complications. The first complication is Australia. In 2015, the geographer Patrick Nunn and the linguist Nicholas Reid published a study analysing 21 Aboriginal oral traditions from around the Australian coast that described the permanent flooding of previously dry land. The stories were remarkably specific. The Yidindji people near Cairns told of a time when Fitzroy Island was part of the mainland and Green Island was 4 times larger. Naming specific landmarks with historical cultural associations that are now underwater. Tiwi Islanders described a mythological old woman who crawled between Bathurst and Melville Islands, followed by water that separated them from the mainland. Aboriginal groups along the south coast told of places where people once hunted kangaroo and emu on land that is now ocean. Nunn and Reid calculated the minimum sea depth required for the geographical details in each story to be accurate, then compared those depths to the established sea level envelope for Australia. Their conclusion, the stories, appeared to describe real coastal configurations that existed between 7,250 and 13,070 years ago. Some of the traditions, if taken at face value, preserved memories of specific landscapes from more than 10,000 years before the first European arrived to write them down. The evidence was striking in its specificity. These were not vague tales of divine judgment. They were geographical accounts describing named places, named landmarks, transitions from dry land to sea, in locations where the geological record confirmed that precisely those transitions had occurred at precisely those depths. The stories all told of water rising, never of water falling. They came from every part of the Australian coast, from Queensland to Western Australia, from the Torres Strait to Tasmania, separated by thousands of kilometres and by linguistic barriers that made direct cultural transmission virtually impossible. And yet they all said the same thing: the sea came, and the land was lost, and we remember where the land used to be. In Tasmania, the evidence went further still. Palawa stories described a time when Lutruwita, Tasmania, was connected to the mainland by a land bridge. Geological data confirms the Bashan land bridge narrowed to just 5 kilometres around 12,700 years ago, before being permanently severed. The Palawa traditions not only recalled the land connection, but also described the position of the star Canopus in the southern sky as it would have appeared 14,000 years ago, a detail independently verifiable. Through astronomical calculations of stellar precession, the stars and the seas, both remembered, both accurate. This was extraordinary. The scholarly consensus had held that oral traditions rarely survive more than 800 years, a millennium, at most, before degrading beyond recognition. Nunn and Reid were proposing that Aboriginal oral traditions had maintained geographically verifiable information for 7 to 13,000 years, passed through hundreds of generations without the aid of writing, preserved by the systematic intergenerational transmission practices that are central to Aboriginal culture. If Australian oral traditions could do this, could Southeast Asian traditions do the same? The answer is we do not know. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The structural parallels between Southeast Asian flood myths and the actual drowning of Sundaland are tantalizing. The timing is right, the geography is right, the direction of the water is right. The stories describe water rising over flat land, which is precisely what happened to the Sunda Shelf. They describe survivors taking to boats, which is what the coastal populations of Sundaland would have done. They describe a lost homeland beneath the sea, which is exactly what Sundaland became. And the concentration of flood myths is densest in precisely the region most affected by the drowning mainland and island Southeast Asia, the zone where Sundaland once stood and where its refugees would have gone. But correlation is not causation, and the chain of transmission That would be required stories told on the shores of Sundaland 13,000 years ago, carried by dispersing populations across thousands of kilometers of ocean, maintained through the arrival of Neolithic farmers, the spread of Austronesian languages, the rise and fall of Hindu Buddhist kingdoms and Islamic sultanates and European colonial empires, and delivered intact to the anthropologists and folklorists of the 20th century, is longer and more complex than anything documented for Aboriginal Australia. The Aboriginal traditions were maintained by cultures that remained in place on the same coast, telling the same stories about the same landmarks in an unbroken chain of habitation that stretches back tens of thousands of years. The Southeast Asian traditions would have had to survive, not displacement carried by migrants to new islands, to new continents, to new linguistic and cultural contexts, translated and retranslated through languages that did not exist when the stories were first told. Some scholars, like Oppenheimer, see the myths as memories. Others, like Van Binsbergen, see them as archetypes. The honest answer lies somewhere in the uncertainty between these positions. The myths may contain fragments of real memory embedded in narrative structures that are themselves universal. The flood is real. The stories may be too, or the stories may be independent responses to a world in which water is always and everywhere, both giver and taker of life. What is not in doubt is the legacy. Sundaland is sometimes called the real Atlantis. It is not. Atlantis was a literary device, a fable Plato invented to make a philosophical argument about hubris and the impermanence of power. Sundaland was a real place. Its rivers are mapped. Its coastlines are dated. Its people are alive, carrying its genetic signature in their cells. To call it Atlantis diminishes, it reduces a documented geological and human catastrophe to a myth about a myth. Sundaland does not need Atlantis. It has something better evidence. And what the evidence shows is that the drowning was not an ending. It was a transformation. The people who left the drowning continent did not vanish. They became something new. The fragmentation of Sundaland, the breaking of a continent into 10,000 islands, created the conditions for one of the most remarkable cultural achievements in human history, the development of long-distance maritime navigation. Consider the timeline. By 65,000 years ago, the people of Sundaland were crossing open water on bamboo rafts to reach Sahul. By the time the drowning was complete, around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, they were island dwellers by necessity, inheritors of a maritime tradition refined across millennia, living on fragments of a former continent separated from each other and from the mainland by channels of water that had once been valleys and plains. Imagine one of them. 7,000 years ago, a man in an outrigger canoe a vessel that would have seemed miraculous to any Mediterranean sailor of the same era paddling between islands that had been, within the memory of his community's oldest stories, a single piece of land. Behind him, the island he calls home, a forested peak rising from the sea, its coastal shelf narrow, its resources limited, its population growing. Ahead, another island, visible as a dark shape on the horizon, reachable in a day's paddling if the currents cooperate. He carries seeds. He carries tools. He carries the knowledge of his grandparents, who carried the knowledge of their grandparents, who carried the knowledge of a world in which the water was always rising and the only constant was the need to move. When the Austronesian expansion began in earnest, roughly 5,000 years ago, carrying outrigger, canoe technology, double-hulled sailing vessels, and a system of celestial navigation that would eventually reach from Madagascar to Easter Island. It was building on this foundation, a foundation of maritime knowledge that stretched back tens of thousands of years into the Pleistocene. The farmers from Taiwan brought rice and pottery and language, but the sea knowledge was already there, waiting for them, built into the culture and the muscle memory and the boat-building traditions of a people who had been living on and with the ocean since before agriculture existed. The ocean that took their homeland gave them a new identity. The descendants of Sundaland's people became the Malay, the Javanese, the Balinese, the Filipino, the Polynesian. They became the navigators who crossed the Pacific, who settled the remotest islands on Earth, who carried the outrigger canoe across a third of the globe. Their genes carry the signature of the drowned continent, the deep, pre-Neolithic ancestry that persists in every population of maritime Southeast Asia. Their languages, whatever their ultimate origin, are spoken on islands that were once mountaintops. Their cultures are shaped by water in a way that no inland civilization could understand water as highway, as boundary, as food source, as threat, as home. Every island in Indonesia is a monument to what was lost, and every boat in the archipelago is a monument to what was gained. Sea level rise today is measured in millimeters per year. During meltwater pulse 1A, it was centimeters. The rate is different. The direction is the same. And the lesson of Sundaland, that the ocean is patient, that it takes land in increments so small that individual generations can ignore them, that the loss is cumulative and irreversible, and eventually total, is not ancient history. It is a preview. The coastal cities of the modern world, Jakarta and Bangkok, Ho Chi Minh City and Mumbai, Miami, sit on the same kinds of flat, low-lying ground that Sundaland's people once called home. The water took that ground. It is taking this ground too. Slowly, imperceptibly, in millimeters that will become centimeters, that will become meters, over timescales that we will not live to see completed, but that our descendants will inherit. Sundaland teaches us that the ocean does not negotiate. It does not pause for human plans. It takes what it takes, and the people who live on its margins have two choices: move or be swallowed. The people of Sundaland moved, and they became the greatest maritime civilization the ancient world ever knew. Come back to the river. The same late light, the same flat green plains stretching in every direction, warm and humid and alive with the sound of insects and the slow current of brown water. But the woman is gone. She has been gone for 13,000 years. The camp is gone. The forest is gone. The fish she carried in leaves are a species that no one alive today has a name for, swimming in a river that flows nowhere, mapped only in the topography of a drowned seabed. Stand where she stood, or rather, float, because this is ocean now, 40 meters of warm salt water above the mud where her footprints dried in the late afternoon sun. A fishing boat crosses overhead, its hull a dark shadow on the surface. The fisherman aboard does not know what is below him. He does not know that his net hangs in the air of a vanished world, that the water he fishes was, in a time beyond the reach of any living memory, a river, a forest, a homeland for people whose genes he carries in every cell of his body. The Molengraaf River is still there. Its channel is visible on sonar, a scar in the seafloor, a crease in the mud following the same course it carved 20,000 years ago when the woman walked beside it. The tributaries are there. The delta is there. The whole drainage architecture of a continent, preserved beneath the sea, waiting for someone with the right instruments and the right questions to bring it back to the surface of human knowledge. We do not know what they built. We do not know what they believed. We do not know the names they gave to their rivers, or the songs they sang around their fires, or the stories they told their children about where the world came from, and why the rain falls and what happens to the dead. All of that is gone dissolved into the 8,000 years of ocean that separates their world from ours, carried away by the same water that carried away their land. But we know they were there. The genetics say so. The sonar says so. The sediment cores, with their layered autobiography of a drowning continent, say so. And possibly, just possibly, the flood myths say so too, in their fragmentary and mythologized, impossibly ancient way, a memory of water rising over flat land, of a homeland swallowed by the sea, of survivors who took to boats and sailed into a world they had to build from scratch. What remains is the ocean, and the islands, those mountain peaks of a drowned continent, rising above the waves like headstones in a cemetery that covers 1,000,000 square kilometers of seafloor. Borneo, Sumatra, Java, the Philippines, the 10,000 islands of Indonesia, scattered across 3 time zones and 2 oceans, each one a fragment of something that was once whole. And what remains, and too, are the people. The Malay fisherman casting his net over the Mullingraf River without knowing it. The Javanese farmer whose ancestors walked from Borneo to Java on dry land. The Filipino navigator whose great-great-grandmothers, 1,000 generations back, pushed a bamboo raft into the deep water of Wallacea and paddled toward a horizon they could not see beyond. They are all here. They are all the children of a continent that no longer exists. They carry it in their mitochondria, in their Y chromosomes, in the deep stratigraphy of their genomes layer upon layer. Farmer over forager, Austronesian over Hoabinhian, the Neolithic written atop the Pleistocene. But the Pleistocene still there, still legible, still whispering beneath everything that came after. The continent is gone. Its people are not. They became the islands. They became the ocean between the islands. They became the boats and the languages and the stories told by firelight on shores that did not exist when their ancestors were alive. The ice melted. The water rose. The land drowned, and the people, as people always do, survived. Not by holding on to what was lost, but by learning to live on what remained, by building boats, by reading stars, by carrying their dead with them in memory and their living forward into the unknown. This is what we know. This is what the sonar and the sediment cores and the genomes and the myths, taken together, tell us that a continent existed, and it was home, and it drowned, and the people who lost it did not end. They scattered. They adapted. They became the navigators, the islanders, the seafarers who populated half the world's ocean. The loss was real. The survival was real. And the connection between the woman on the riverbank 20,000 years ago and the fisherman on the South China Sea today, between the Hoabinhian tool maker in a limestone cave and the Polynesian navigator reading the stars 1,000 miles from land, that connection is written in the blood and carried in the stories and visible, if you know where to look, in every island, every strait, every shallow sea that covers the floor of a drowned world. The river is under the ocean now. The forest is under the ocean. The camps, the paths, the places where children played and elders told stories, all of it under the patient, indifferent weight of the South China Sea. But the stories continue. Somewhere tonight, on an island that was once a mountaintop, someone is telling a child about a great flood, about a time before the water, about a world that was lost and a people who were not. We do not know if the story is a memory or a dream. We may never know. But the child listens, and the words settle into the quiet space where old things live, where the voice of a grandmother becomes the voice of a grandmother's grandmother, becomes the voice of someone standing on the bank of a river that no longer flows, carrying fish in leaves, walking home through warm air and the sound of insects and the smell of a forest that will stand for another 8,000 years before the water takes it. Listen, the story is very old. It may be the oldest story in the world. And it is not finished yet.